So you're a teacher of creative writing.
That's right.
What makes you think you can teach it?
Well, my students might argue I can't, but well, see, I've been teaching now for 4 years. I teach poetry, fiction, actually teach nature writing as well, and documentary journalism. And yeah, they all have their separate challenges, but currently the class I'm teaching, well, if I weren't in Latvia, I'd be there right now actually, is a poetry class. And most of my students are pretty intimidated by the idea of writing a poem. So I think the first thing is to just get them comfortable with the idea that they can write a poem, and break them out of the idea that a poem is some kind of puzzle that they have to figure out, which I think they get trained in as high school students usually. So I usually start with just trying to demystify it a little. Mm-hmm. And but the idea of teaching writing, yeah, it's hard. I think one of the best things I can do is share with them the work that I love and try to share my passion for it with them, and hope that that kind of becomes infectious, you know. So.
Do you think anyone should try to write a poem?
Well, Keats said that if poetry doesn't come as naturally as leaves to a tree, it ought not come at all. So I think in some ways, maybe poets do kind of come about more naturally than other professions where you can train and study and succeed. You know, I know that some of my students are very talented, but I know that they won't go on writing beyond my class. But then there are some students who I can see it's an obsession that's going to remain with them. So I used to kind of proselytize and try to make everyone into a poet, and now I feel like the ones who are truly poets will keep going, and the ones who aren't will at least have gained an interest in it and might continue reading poems beyond my class. But so that's how I kind of approach it. I say I probably have about 1 or 2 students a year who I think are really going to continue and might actually publish one day. So,
is it necessary to learn how to write poem? Is it necessary to read as much as possible and other poets?
I would say so. You know, I do think that it's commonly said, and at least in America, that one should be reading contemporary poetry, but I actually don't believe that to be true. I think you seek out the poets who mean the most to you, and if, like for me, one of them would be John Keats, and for others, you know, they might be more interested in contemporary writers. But no matter who you're reading, yeah, I think you have to find the poets who you passionately love, and their work will kind of find its way into yours. So my dad is a poet, so I've been reading poems since I was a little kid, and it's just an amalgam of so many influences. I can't even really discern who's influenced me the most. I've read so many, and the ones who I love the most have kind of stuck around, and it's a big stew, you know, and I think that that's probably good for poets to have that huge that just huge reservoir of work that you really resonate with.
What is the best way to read?
Read a poem?
A book of poetry. To read it from the beginning to the end, or one by one, one poem by one, or to reread many times. What's your recipe? Yeah,
that's a good question. I think right now I don't know about in Latvian poetry, but in American poetry right now, there's a tendency to try to write a book that has a kind of theme throughout, so the poems will connect in some story, or there'll be a character running through them. I actually just don't really enjoy that kind of book. I like individual poems. If I could write one poem that's memorable in my lifetime, I'll be happy. So I'm more drawn to the individual poems. So when I open up a book of poems, I kind of randomly read through it. I usually don't read from beginning to end. But I know other people approach a book of poems as if it were a novel, and they'll start page 1 and proceed through it that way. Maybe it's just my personal preference.
I was always amused by those poems published in a magazine, one poem in between articles and stuff. Do you understand how to choose the right poem to publish?
Of my own or others?
Individually.
Of my own to send out for publication, or of others?
For an editor.
Right.
How to choose? What they are choosing?
Yeah, I think it's very subjective. I actually worked for a publishing company as an intern for a little while, poetry press called Copper Canyon, and I had to read through all the submissions of manuscripts that would come in because it's a very famous press, and so they'd get lots of submissions, and I was supposed to kind of read through them pretty quickly and discern which ones to pass on to the main editor. And I guess my approach is if it struck me, if it was clear, if I understood what was going on in the poem, then I was more likely to pass it on. I find a lot of poetry to be completely opaque, and I think my students also find poetry sometimes to be very opaque, and therefore they think that they're supposed to confuse the reader. And so they go about trying to confuse the reader, which I think is a strange thing for a writer to do. So I guess I value clarity, and I hope that editors would value clarity, but I think many actually want a poem that's a little bit more difficult, and so their tastes come through in what they select. I hope that makes sense.
And should the poem be understandable or readable outside of context, or context is necessary?
Well, I always tell my students that you can't follow your poem into the world and explain it for everyone. We're all going to pass away, and the poem hopefully will endure. So you can't be there to kind of speak up for it. So I think it's kind of like a painting. It has to just be sufficient unto itself in a way. So, but I want to be clear. I don't mind poetry that is complicated and complex. What I dislike is confusion for the sake of confusion. So I want to be able to carry the poem with me and not feel like I'm being tricked, and not feel like I need to have a PhD in literature to understand it. Maybe that just comes out of the fact that my dad was a poet and also a dairy farmer, and I would see him read poems to a group of farmers who would understand the poems, and I've always said to myself, if a farmer can't understand my poem, then I don't want to write it. So I don't know if that makes sense, but
do you test your poems?
On others,
or your poems? Do you test before publishing it by reading to farmers or friends?
Yeah, I do share some poems, usually with, sometimes with my dad, we share poems, he and I. They basically, I'll kind of work over a poem, many, many times until I just can't find any other way I can't find a word that I would change. And then I usually feel pretty confident, but whether it gets accepted or not is a whole other thing. It's kind of out of my hands at that point, so. I actually have a group of friends who meet and talk about poems, but we don't usually share our own poems. So I guess I would say I don't share my poems with others as much as some do. Maybe I ought to.
How would you answer to the question, what's the difference between poetry and prose in these days?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I write both, and so I have to, in my own work, I have to keep a pretty clear demarcation, so I know, am I writing a poem in prose, or am I writing prose with line breaks, all of those subtle distinctions. But I think that one thing that's kind of concerning is it's harder and harder these days to decide, to understand why someone wrote a poem and not a story or something. I think that there's a feeling of erosion. Poetry seems to be eroding a bit. why write a poem when you can we could have written a piece of prose. So I think poetry has to maintain those characteristics of music and surprise and meter and all those kind of old-fashioned things. I think it does need to have its own identity, or else it just kind of becomes a kind of an artifact, you know. So I don't know. So yeah, it's I think it's getting harder and harder to see the difference between prose and poetry in contemporary American literature, at least.
But do we need this distinction?
Well, probably it's not so important to distinguish between them. I think if a work really strikes you and resonates with you, it doesn't really matter which genre it's in. But
you can publish a book with text in it, and without saying is it poetry or prose.
You can publish it, and people will either resonate with it or they won't. Yeah. But I think as a practitioner of poetry, I like to know for myself at least whether I'm writing a poem or a story. Yeah.
What is harder?
For me, fiction is harder. Takes more. I find prose to be very arduous. It's like trudging up a mountain, and but I also think that there are aspects of writing a poem that are more difficult, such as deciding when a poem is finished and how much to trouble with it and revise it and things of that nature.
Do you revise your poems after a while?
Not really. Right when I first write the poem, it's usually I'll work on it intensely for a couple days maybe, and then I'll leave it alone, write the next one. So, but I had a teacher once. I told him that I was writing a lot of poems but not revising them, and he said, "You're not a real artist then, because you don't care enough about the poems to really make them perfect." So I think I could probably do with a little more revision. I would prefer to write the next one.
Well, there is this quote, I think it's assigned to Hemingway, but it's not true. You have to write when you are drunk, and you have to edit being sober.
That's right.
And it means that you have to reread and edit after a while, and to choose what's good, what's wrong. So you have to be two different people.
Kind of two different minds.
Yes.
I can't drink while writing either, but try to be sober for the whole process. But yeah, I just put a book of poems together that's going to be published in September, and I'm gesturing because it's in my bag. But I had written the poems over 4 years, and then when you realize it's going to be in the world, you get this kind of anxiety, and you start to really look at them again, and you say, this can't go into the world. This is, I can't allow this to be read by others. And that kind of pressure is really good for me, because that's when I really start to revise. But you can also just, with that other mind that didn't write the poem, you can ruin the poem. You can take the poem and just break it, so you have to be careful. I think that's why Hemingway said you should be sober when you revise, because you don't want to be reckless,
And what's going on in American poetry right now? And do you belong to any trend?
Well, I don't know. I have some. To me, it's very difficult to know what's going on right now, because there's so much being published, which is good and bad. There's this explosion of creative writing programs, there are lots of people writing poems, and there are lots of journals publishing poetry, and that's very good. But I think it's a little bit difficult to kind of get one's, to kind of figure out exactly where one stands in that huge amount of work. And obviously our political situation in America right now is pretty dire, so I think a lot of poets are responding to Trump and to contemporary events, and I think that political poetry tends to be very it can be very affecting and it can be very poignant, but it usually doesn't stick around. And so I think a lot of work is being written right now that's not going to be read in 5 years. So I say that I don't know for sure, but I think that the more topical work about the political situation is pretty popular in America right now, and I don't think it's going to be the work that people read in the future. I think it's the more personal, quieter poems that aren't getting read right now that are going to last. At least I hope so. But obviously a bit biased in that way.
I was talking to Estonian writer a couple of days ago, Marja Kangro, and she said that nowadays books are lasting only for a couple of years, and you cannot be a writer thinking that your books will live when you will end. And is it true? Does literature is actual only for a couple of years now?
I think about that a lot. I mean, as a teacher, I watch my students. Their minds are becoming more and more distracted by the internet, by their phones. I think the experience of reading and focusing on something it's getting eroded. And when you have a readership that's less able to kind of focus, I think you're going to find work is going to be digested more swiftly and then discarded. And so I think it's more of a issue of readers and what we can kind of focus upon and concentrate upon as readers. I myself find it difficult to find quiet time to just read Tolstoy, which I used to do with pleasure. Now it'd be hard for me to get through Anna Karenina again, as much as I love it. So I don't think of it so much as my own work. Is my own work going to last beyond me? Are there going to be people who take the act of reading a poem seriously 50 years from now? I do worry about that. I'm sorry to say. Do you have that fear as well, or?
No, I don't know.
Sorry, I didn't mean to turn the interview upon you.
Seeing how things are coming back, like vinyl records.
That's a good point.
Or
yeah.
cassettes.
Yeah. Or bookstores.
and also books will come back as a nostalgic thing, or as a real thing to touch and to read.
That's an excellent point. So like a decade ago, everyone was really worried in America that, and maybe here as well, that there weren't going to be any bookstores. And there's this, there's actually more bookstores now, I think, than there were a decade ago. So, yeah.
You said that creative writing classes are much popular now.
Yeah.
And not everybody who is going to those classes want to be a writer, and sometimes people are using it just as a kind of therapy or a thing that can help to concentrate, some substitution to meditation or yoga classes.
Yeah.
Do you see this process going in your class also?
Yeah. I think I teach a class called Creative Expression, which it's called that by the university. Well, that implies that we're creatively expressing ourselves. I think that's the opposite of what a poet does. Keats said the poet is the most unpoetical character. You have to empty yourself. You have to be selfless, and that idea of that writing does not necessarily come from the ego or from the I, and I think it's a totally different kind of writing to write for therapy. I don't want to disparage it because I think it's very helpful for people, but that needs to be distinguished from the kind of art that I try to make and that others are trying to make, which is actually hopefully devoid of self-expression. So in other words, I think there's plenty of room for it, but I just think that the conflation of self-expression and art and this other kind of work that we're talking about is not helpful. Maybe there should just be separate programs for that kind of work, because it's almost like you're playing with two different sports, on the same field. So it's just.
But there is this need to write things away from you, and people are using many different tools now, writing anonymous blogs and telling things they can't tell anyone in person.
Yeah. And
writing is used in many ways.
Well, see, I think that that's the way to do it, because if you're confessing, if you're trying to alarm readers, or you're trying to, you put your name with something that's very personal, I think that you're not quite letting go of it. You're going into the world with it, But to write it anonymously on a blog, that's probably very healthy. You're like you said, writing away that emotion, and so I think there are a lot of writers who are using confession to make a name for themselves, which I think is kind of, I don't know. Does that make sense?
There is this term like confessional poetry.
Yeah, and I think it's come back very, very much so. Yeah, in American poetry. And I don't know. But maybe it's just aesthetically. It's just not what I practice myself, and therefore I don't resonate with it like others do. But that seems to be a real current right now, because we had poets like, Sylvia Plath and Sexton and Robert Lowell and in the 60s and 70s, and confessional poetry. It seems to be kind of having a resurgence in America. So,
can you say the names of the less favorite?
Oh, the least.
The worst. Oh, the worst. Yes.
The worst.
By your point of view.
Like living poets who I despise.
Okay, you can start with the dead ones.
Let's start with the dead ones. Yeah. So let me think. The poets. They don't even really come to mind, because I think it's just they're so off my radar. They're not even. Their influence is not pressed upon me enough to even recall their names. So. I don't know. I honestly can't think of any poets who I truly kind of sit there and am frustrated by their presence in an anthology or something. It's kind of like music when you don't like a certain band or something. You don't actively dislike the band, you just don't listen to them. Or maybe if you hear one of their songs, you're like, you just turn down the radio. Mm-hmm. That's kind of how I feel about that. Sorry, I really wish I could think of a name. That'd be fun.
Do you know how to tell a bad poetry from a good one?
Well, I think I do, but many would say that I'm just, being subjective and conceited, and that my version of a good poem is different from everyone else's. But I do believe that there's objective. I think that there's, just like in any art, like in music, when you can tell whether a song is in tune or I guess some people like dissonant music that hurts their ears, but most people want to hear music that's beautiful. And so I think it's similar with poetry, but it's a little harder to quantify it. And so I spend a lot of time trying to explain why I dislike certain poems and love other poems. And I oftentimes feel like I'm just kind of talking to myself. It's hard to convey. For instance, with I love metaphor. And so I tell my students there are just really great metaphors that make the world feel magical and new and fresh, and try to convey why. But if they don't experience that from just reading the metaphor, nothing I can say is probably going to convey it to them. Anyway, it's the great struggle of my life to convey why a poem is good and why another poem is not. So.
In Latvia, we are sometimes saying that poetry helps keeping our language alive and evolving. Does poetry helps English language also?
Yeah.
Does it still help?
Does it still help? Well, I think that we do live in a, well, not to always, not to bring up our president too much, because I don't like to talk about him very much, but we're seeing in America right now this kind of erosion of language, how language is used, and Twitter, people are really, really recklessly using language, and I do think that a poem kind of, I don't want to use a word so strong as sanctifies language, but brings language back to its origins, and I kind of feel like I am, when I write a poem, kind of cleaning something up that's being sullied somewhat. So, but yeah. So I would say yes. I would say yes that poetry in America is making the language healthy in some sense, even if it's a bad poem. I think just the attention to language is helpful. And healthy, yeah.
And poetry can help understand language also.
Yeah, because I think you're working with the very foundations of language here. Like I love the poet Paul Celan, the German poet Paul Celan, and how his poems are very. Have you read him very much?
Not much.
Yeah, well, he's
So
very
I know him. Yes.
He's a difficult poet. But his poems are they're almost like objects in and of themselves. He's really getting right down to the bare bones of language, and I love that. So that's, I think, one thing that poetry can do. Yeah, in a way that maybe even fiction can't.
Do you believe it's possible to translate a poem?
Well, I wish I had experience doing it. I don't really have any other languages aside from English. But I'm interested in translation, and one thing I do with my students is give them multiple translations of the same poem and ask them to choose the one they think is best. I don't think there's any right translation. Certain translations will have a better line here, and another one will have a better line here, and you might lose a lot of the music of a poem, and I took a Russian class once. I didn't learn Russian, but I was interested in Russian literature, so I took a class, and I really liked the Russian poet Akhmatova, and I wanted to hear an Akhmatova poem in Russian, so I gave it to my teacher and asked her if she could read it to me in Russian, and she read it, and I heard the poem in this amazing way that I would never have been able to hear it in English, and I did feel like something was lacking in the English version, but at least I had the poem. It's not the best situation, but it's the closest I could get to reading her. So, but a long-winded answer to your question is, I think a lot is lost, as they say, in translation. So,
but is it necessary?
Yes, absolutely. I would hate to be deprived of all all those poems. Neruda and Lorca and Akhmatova, and I haven't read much of the Latvian poets, but I would love to read them as well. I don't want to wait till I learn Latvian. It'd be about 40 years, I think.
I just recently tried to edit a translation of Latvian poetry in English, and I was a little bit shocked by how freely they are translating it. And I see in Latvian poem a specific rhythm and intonation.
Were they being loose with the language, or with the vocabulary, or with the rhythm, or both, I guess?
And in translation, it's always longer. Yeah. Because you have to explain each thing.
Yeah, right.
And we always were thinking that Latvian language is longer than English language. English has shorter words, much more. We have longer words, but a translation is always longer in English.
That's interesting.
It was terrible because we are publishing a magazine and we have the same layout for Latvian and English version.
So you have to juggle the pages differently.
Yes, I have to shorten the English text.
It was really interesting last night at the reading I did, hearing the Latvian version of my story, and only a couple of words I got because they're, the names of coffee or beer or something that weren't translatable. But it was the same imagery, of course, the same story, but it had a completely different, rhythm to it. And maybe rather than saying something's been lost, we could think of it as something being added to it. But hopefully what's being added is good. It's worth it.
But sometimes it's too much.
Sometimes it's too much, I agree. I think that sometimes translators probably try to fill in, like you're saying, and they clutter it up.
Especially for a poem, if you say too much.
Yeah, you don't want to over-explain a line. Right.
Do you think it's necessary to hear how an author is reading his poem?
Well, sometimes you hear it by the poet and you wish you hadn't, It depends on the quality of the reading. I think some poets oftentimes... well, I don't know. I've been to many readings, many, too many. And what I value is... this contradicts what I said earlier. You said something about context, and does a poem need context? But I think sometimes with the reading, I like to hear a little bit of banter in between. I want to hear a little bit about how the poem came to be, and... I don't like to go to a reading where the poet just kind of declaims their poems one after the other, as if we're not there, So I like to go to readings because it gives me an opportunity to see the person who made the poem and maybe understand a little bit more where the poems came from. Yeah.
In meeting the readers or listeners of your poems, do you have questions from them?
Yes, sometimes I do.
And what was the most awkward question?
The most awkward question? Oh man, that's a great question. Well, the most useless question is, what were you thinking when you wrote this? Because you're not really thinking. If you're really writing a poem, it's more like dreaming, So it's hard. The poet is the last person one should ask about a poem because, I guess some of my poems are somewhat political and so, or have to do with, for instance, I wrote a poem about Monsanto, in the Midwest and in America. I think Monsanto's been very damaging to communities there, and industrial agriculture has really been very difficult for small family farm that I grew up on. And I went back to the place I grew up to read from my book of poems, and I had a question from the audience saying, you stand up there and you romanticize the small farm you grew up on, but how are we going to feed the whole world? So that kind of challenge to the way that I was romanticizing my childhood by someone who said, you're just kind of living a dream, it's not reality. And I had a hard time responding to that one, because I think in some ways he was right, and yet I can't help but defend what I defend. So it was more of a question out of his political beliefs versus mine than about the poem itself. But the poem conjured that question, so I had to deal with it.
And which was the latest poem you wrote?
The latest one?
And when? How many time ago? How much time ago?
Well, probably I've written poems since finishing my book, but I think the last poem in my new book is the last one that I really kind of kept. Yeah. So,
and what was it about?
Well, I would read it, but it's a bit long. I don't know if you want to hear it. It's about a certain quality of light that I remember from childhood, because I lived at the end of this on a farm at the end of a long lane, and it's about walking down this lane in the evening, and that quality of light that I actually noticed in Latvia last evening. That kind of in the summer, kind of celebrating that. So that's the last poem that I wrote, I think, that I actually thought this is worth putting in the book.